Good morning. My name's Steve Maher. We're going to go ahead and see if my advancer works. There we go, a little too much. There we go. Do I have control, DJ? All right, good. Yeah, good morning. My name's Steve Maher. I'm going to be subbing for Kareem Black today and talking to you about the CFATS program, Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, and giving you a little bit of overview and also talking about top screen. But first, a little bit of background on the company. Risk Management Professionals, most of you know us as a firm that specializes in process safety and risk management, specifically rollout of process safety management plans, risk management programs, and all the things that go with that. A lot of people call us for HAZOP and LOPA studies and CIS and SIL evaluations, and all the things that are associated with PSM and RMP. And your question might be, well, why are you talking about CFATS? Well, we're going to see during our presentation that there's a lot of overlap in the sort of things that you have to evaluate for process safety management and risk management programs and the DHS's program on CFATS. And we'll be getting into that a little bit more later. But first, before we do that, a little bit about a little housekeeping here in terms of what we're doing. We're using a GoToWebinar interface, which means that we can broadcast to a lot of folks across a wide audience, but you are being put on mute. At the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. You're welcome to request to our producer, DJ Kumar, who's being assisted by Sarah Willman. You're welcome to chat with the producer and either ask a question that way or request to be taken off mute and vocalize your question directly during the question and answer process. The reason why we keep you on mute during the presentation is so you can continue your normal duties at your office, and the rest of the audience won't be tuned into your phone calls or whatever else is going on in your office. So before we go further, oh yes, in terms of that interface, you can communicate with the producer. You can also use your mouse to resize the windows that are associated with the presentation itself or the video image of the speaker, which is me. So anyhow, let's talk a little bit more about your speaker. There we go. Again, my name is Steve Maher. I'm with Risk Management Professionals. Been around the block a few times. I've got a couple of engineering degrees, a couple of professional engineering certifications, and been involved in some really cool projects over the years. And I had the honor of being involved in one of the first renditions of the Technical Steering Committee of the CCPS in the mid-1980s. So I've had the privilege of working with on some really cool projects and with some wonderful people over the years, and just want to share some of the things that I've encountered over the years. And in this case, today we'll be focusing on CFATS. What we'll be doing is giving a little overview of what the regulatory requirements are, a little bit of background so you can put them in context, a little bit about the CFATS process, how it overlaps with process safety management and risk management programs. Understanding this will help you encapsulate your program at your plant site and roll it out in the most efficient way possible. Talking a little bit about the Chemical Security Assessment Tool, CSAT, the latest rendition being 2.0, some of the changes, some of the requirements, and then conclude with what do we recommend in terms of how do you proceed and how do you integrate this program with the other things at your plant site. There we go. So first, a regulatory overview. And actually, excuse me, DJ, where's the receiver for this? All right, good. All right. Yeah, I've been pointing in the wrong direction. Okay, a little bit about regulatory history. The World Trade Center attacks obviously caused a ripple effect to a lot of people as a wake-up call to the need for enhanced security on a number of different levels in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security was founded in late 2002. And, things don't necessarily happen overnight in Washington. Sometimes their politics get in the way. Sometimes there's debate on what to do. And so a lot of people were discussing, what do we do about chemical facility security? Well, the EPA already had a program for risk management programs that looked at facilities that could be an acute risk to the public. OSHA had a program, process safety management, that were looking at things that could be an acute risk to personnel. So how do we fit into how does the chemical facility security fit into this jigsaw puzzle? And basically what they did is they decided that as part of the Homeland Security Appropriations Act for DHS to establish risk-based performance standards for chemical facility security. The idea being there is a mandate to assess the need for security how to follow through with those needs, and then do compliance inspections, all spearheaded by the Department of Homeland Security. So that's the onus for where all this stuff came from. And as part of that, CFATS, Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, came about as a proposed rulemaking in 2006. An interim final rule came out in 2007. And basically, a final rule came out in late 2007 that codified a list of chemicals of interest. That is, if you had certain chemicals at your site, you might be on the radar screen for having to have some sort of security vulnerability assessment and some sort of site security plan, and also screening threshold quantities. Not only what kind of chemical, but how much and what kind of threat was it addressing. The program was rolled out. Facilities did their part of it. DHS did its part of it. And in the 2014 time frame, there was a requirement to recodify and also recertify a 4-year certification for DHS to continue on with the CFATS program. So the CFATS Act of 2014 was put forth to really recodify things and bring it through 2018 to basically reinvigorate the CFATS program. Also, as part of the CFATS Act of 2014, you had an expedited approval program. What they found out is there's a lot of facilities, a lot of chemicals to look at, and what they wanted to do is separate the important facilities from the less important facilities and have an expedited approval program for those that could be expedited, and not the DHS wouldn't have to pay as much attention to them. Guidance for the expedited approval program came out in 2015, and also various requirements for the different tiers were put forth in the 2014-2015 timeframe. In 2016, there was a need to update the CSAT, or the Chemical Security Assessment Tool, and basically there was a hold put on top screen submittals for a short period of time, and then towards the end of 2016, everything was put into place for people to go through and use the new top screen, the new CSAT 2.0 tool, and also do their SVA and SSP submissions in that framework. So those new requirements, or this rebooting of the existing requirements in late 2016, is really what we can focus on right now. This particular slide gives a little bit of background on those chemicals of interest that are in Appendix A. You're looking at a number of different threats associated with that. As you know, when you're doing a security vulnerability assessment, or when you're assessing the need for security and also formulating a site security plan to address any potential vulnerabilities, the whole idea of security issues is that you need to address the potential for a threat, basically an adversary that may have the will and the ability to want to do harm to your facility or to use those chemicals. A vulnerability, based on that threat assessment, what kind of potential is there for follow through and for that threat to become something that can have an impact at your facility, and then what are the consequences? Rolling to get consequences being perhaps a release of the chemical that can hurt somebody, perhaps sabotage at the facility, perhaps theft, so they could use certain chemicals as your adversary doing something undesirable at another location. So those various threats, coupled with the vulnerability, coupled with the consequences, are really what you're looking at as part of the CFATS program when you're assessing vulnerabilities and then deciding what to do about it to address the vulnerabilities as part of your site security plan. So the chemicals of interest list in Appendix A really pivots on that. The numbers that you see when you're looking at potential release concerns, by no coincidence, are nearly identical to the other numbers that are used as part of risk management programs and also process safety management. When you're looking at the big picture here, if you're looking at release consequences, well gosh, a release that can impact off-site, that would be something that would be of interest to the EPA with respect to risk management programs. Large quantities of chemicals that can impact personnel would be of interest to OSHA. And the same kind of chemical that has a potential impact off-site, well gosh, it's the same consequences as what the EPA is looking at as part of its risk management program. So the values, screening threshold quantities in Appendix A for CFATS for the kind of concerns when you've got a release that can hurt somebody are the same in most instances. Obviously, there's some variations too with certain chemicals that might be more desirable from a theft perspective, and other chemicals that might be more desirable from a sabotage perspective. Those other threats might have different threshold quantities or screening threshold quantities, the STQs. So that's where the chemicals in Appendix A come from. That's why you see a lot of correlation with RMP and PSM, and we'll talk more about that shortly. There's also fuels. Basically, top screen needs to look at flammable materials too, but if there's small quantities, obviously it's not much of an interest. If the fuel is not classified as NFPA 4, that means it's got a fairly low boiling point. I'm sorry, fairly high boiling point, something above 73 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's got a flash point above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning that any vapors are not likely to ignite in the presence of an ignition source at that temperature, then basically you got a material that's not as much of an interest. So the chemicals of interest and the screening threshold quantities do reflect the potential for a flammable material to be something that can cause mischief. All right, so there's other information here in terms of the fuels exemption and a lot of details that I just don't have time to go through this morning in this context. The one thing that you're going to see throughout this presentation is a lot of links to useful information on the DHS site and other sites so that you can get more information on the CFATS program. And really, if you're doing your own assessment, provide the background, the guidelines, all the tools that you need to get the job done. So what's been happening? There we go. What's been happening in terms of regulatory statistics? There have been a lot of submissions. Many facilities have multiple top screen submissions because they've got different types of processes. So over 40,000 unique facilities have been submitting top screens, which is your initial screening tool to determine where you fall into the CFATS program and how much care needs to be taken in terms of the degree of assessment needed or how detailed your site security plan needs to be. Obviously, some people decided, gosh, I don't really need all these chemicals or the same quantity, so they were pulled out. They pulled themselves out of the program. And what's happening currently is 3,500 facilities are currently covered by CFATS. That means the DHS is tracking them, doing compliance inspections, and basically working with the facility to make sure that their site security plan meets the needs of protecting the facility and also protecting the public. And as I mentioned before, we're going to go a little bit more into how the program rolls out in a few minutes. But basically, the DHS does provide compliance assistance, authorization inspections as the program is being started up, and also compliance inspections, which happen periodically without a lot of notice from the DHS, but they do happen periodically to go through and verify that the facility is in compliance with respect to the chemicals of interest, the management of those, developing a security vulnerability assessment, and a site security plan. Anyhow, we got, as for part of any of these programs, we got acronym soup. We got tons and tons of acronyms and that you need to be paying attention to really understand how the DHS is rolling out. This is just provided for your reference only. So let's talk about the process. And most of you won't be able to see this flowchart unless you really get up close to your screen and squint a bit. But basically, this will roll out how the DHS looks at these programs and what they do with them. First step is registration. If you have to do a top screen or interface with the DHS as part of the CFATS program, you register. It's a security. These are security issues. So there are specific user IDs and passwords provided, and there's pretty tight controls over who should be getting this information. Once that communications link is established, a top screen, which is a computer program that collects information and provides a framework for assessing, basically, in general context, potentially how risky is the facility. The user fills that out. The people at the facility fill that out, or if you need support, you call a consultant like risk management professionals to help you fill it out. And basically what it does is it lays out some of the basic characteristics of your facility so the DHS can then determine, based on the top screen inputs, how high a risk facility is from a security perspective. Obviously that determination is made, and then the DHS decides what the next step is. the next step might be, if you're in a, and we'll talk about the different tiers in a couple of minutes, if you're in a Tier 1 high-risk facility, the DHS may be requiring a very strict security vulnerability assessment based on guidelines that are provided and looking at all the various adversarial threats, potential vulnerabilities, and potential consequences. Once that security vulnerability assessment is done, a site security plan needs to be put together that pivots on potential vulnerabilities and addresses them to minimize the vulnerabilities, to minimize the risks associated with security at your chemical facility. It's a cyclical approach. Once these are done, they're submitted to the DHS. The DHS has a right to inspect them, provide feedback, tell you to do more, tell you that you don't have to do as much, whatever, and then perform compliance inspections to make sure that they're comfortable with the degree of security that you're providing at your facility to minimize the potential security risks associated with the chemicals at your plant site. So that's all part of this program, and what it boils down to is initial user submission, DHS determination of what tier you're in, and then developing a security vulnerability assessment or a site security plan to the degree of detail needed to address that threat that your facility poses. And so let's talk about the questionnaire. The questionnaire right now is web-based. The idea, as you might expect, is to collect information so an assessment can be made in terms of potential security risks. So you need to know a little bit about the threat. Those are the sort of things that are usually more readily determined by security professionals. So the DHS asks you to focus on what sort of things can happen at your plant site: sabotage, theft, diversion, release of toxic, flammable, or explosive materials. Basically, information about your plant site so they can really get more information about the consequences associated with your facility operations. This slide gives some examples. Sabotage threats can be of interest for potassium cyanide. Theft could be an issue for things that can be weaponized, like chlorine. Release of toxic materials. There's lots of anhydrous ammonia that's used at lots of facilities in the United States. Toxic releases of anhydrous ammonia, hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen sulfide, and a lot of other materials are clearly of interest. Flammable materials can also be a security vulnerability, and also explosive materials like TNT. Controlling those, who has access to it, those sort of things need to be put into your chemical facility security program. So as I mentioned before, the DHS uses this information to determine how risky your facility is. It basically uses a tiering approach. Tier 1 is the highest risk. Tier 4 is the lowest risk. If you're not even tiered, then you don't fall into the realm of having to do a site security vulnerability assessment or a site security plan in most cases. So depending on the chemical of interest, top screen questions will vary, and it will pivot on the information needed for DHS to do a preliminary determination of what tier you might fall in. A little bit of information on topography, how much quantity of materials you have on site, where potential receptors are, storage locations. Basically, a lot of these things are inherent in understanding the consequences. And for those of you who also do process safety management and risk management programs, you may recognize the program at the bottom called RMP Comp. It's a fairly simple program. It's available from the EPA, and it's designed to get a general handle on the level of consequences that might be associated with the quantity of chemicals at your plant site. So these are used for preliminary tier determination. Again, Tier 1 being the highest risk, Tier 4 being the lowest risk, and if your facility is not tiered, it means that you're an even lower risk. So this preliminary tier determination is based on use of the CSAT tool, and then for tiers 1, 2, and 3, you should be applying CSAT, Security Vulnerability Assessment tool, to get an idea, a little bit better handle on the level of vulnerabilities at your site. For Tier 4s, you may use the SVA tool or just adopt an alternative security program and bypass the need for doing a security vulnerability assessment. An alternative security program is done instead of the SVA, and it's designed to instill some basic risk-based performance standards that apply to a facility that doesn't represent an acutely high risk. Again, the security vulnerability assessment goes into more detail than the CSAT top screen tool to get a better handle on the facility, potential threats that are that could be imposed at the facility, potential vulnerabilities associated with the facility, i.e., given the threat, what's the likelihood that the adversary can carry through successfully with that threat and cause the consequence that you might be concerned about. So all that's part of the security vulnerability assessment that is then followed through and submitted to DHS. After the security vulnerability assessment, a certain adoption of site security plan would typically make sense to address potential vulnerabilities in the SVA that are identified from the SVA. Risk-based performance standards are used to categorize or bin the sort of things that you want to be addressing to potentially minimize any vulnerabilities that might come out of the SVA. These things are pretty basic, pretty intuitive in many cases. You want to restrict the area perimeter, secure assets, control access to the site, deter, detect, and delay. That means if an adversary is trying to carry through with a threat, some sort of deterrence mechanism, detection of what they're doing, and maybe delaying them so you have time to respond. Theft and diversion, sabotage, cyber, and response issues, obviously as part of a good SSP. And other risk-based performance standards include monitoring training, talking about elevated threats and specific threats, and also reporting of incidents. So all these things are part of risk-based performance standards, and they're binned like this to make sure that you've got a robust site security plan. And again, that would be needed if you're in one of the more higher risk tier levels. So let's talk about overlap between the different programs. I mentioned at the onset that because of the nature of the consequences being very similar for the sort of things that you might be concerned about for risk management programs and the impact on the public, whether maybe something that might be caused by equipment malfunction. Well, an equipment malfunction resulting in a consequence that can impact the public, a person doing something inappropriate that can cause a release that can impact the public, you're really looking at the same quantity of chemicals, the same types of concerns when you're looking at releases. So hence a lot of overlap. Also, for those of you who do risk management programs, there's an entire management system associated with controlling and minimizing the potential risks of that consequence. All right, so that's why there's a lot of overlap between PSM and RMP and CFATS. So all these programs kind of work together to minimize the potential for an adversary causing an undesired consequence, or equipment malfunction causing an undesired consequence, and those undesired consequences that can affect personnel or affect people off-site. So hence the degree of overlap. In a tabular form, we kind of put it together to talk about the different objectives that I just discussed, the types of chemicals that are looked at for the 3 different programs. The big difference for CFATS is, of course, that certain types of chemicals can be weaponized. An adversary can use them for that purpose or cause sabotage, or for some reason want to steal things. For example, anhydrous ammonia is pretty popular for people who want to do methamphetamine production. So those sort of things need to be considered as part of a site security plan, but may not be as big an issue when you're thinking process safety management or risk management programs. So again, we talked about the quantities being very similar. You look at nearly identical across the board for the CFATS, PSM, and RMP for basic chemicals like anhydrous ammonia. For some things like hydrogen sulfide, you see a 10,000/45. Well, certain things are more of interest when there's a threat potential for theft, and those would have different screening threshold quantities, and so you might think things a little differently for CFATS for those specific chemicals. And also flammables, they raise the threshold on propane because of the abundance of that throughout the world, and trying to minimize any potential for focus in an area that really kind of detracts from their ability to focus in other areas that may be more important. Okay, again, submittal requirements. What makes CFATS a little different is the interaction for the agency. For the OSHA PSM program, you put your PSM program together, you're really not submitting anything. For EPA's risk management programs, you've got a fairly extensive safety management system, but only make a fairly simple RMP submittal to the EPA. CFATS is a lot more detailed. You submit a top screen initially for everybody, and then you may also be doing SVAs and site security plans that are then reviewed by DHS. So the submittal requirements are a lot different from CFATS for the other programs. And also the management system is quite a bit different. When you're trying to manage failures that can occur as part of equipment, PSM and RMP look at a lot of things with respect to reliability, mechanical integrity issues, operator training on how to use the system. For CFATS, it's quite a bit different. You're looking at different elements that are designed to buffer that potential for an adversary to carry through on a threat, for the threat to have to find vulnerability in terms of being able to incur the consequence that the adversary desires, and for the consequence to occur. So providing those buffers for human-initiated events, such as for the CFATS program, that requires quite a different management system. So that's one of the biggest differences between CFATS, PSM, and RMP. So let's talk about the CSAT tool, Chemical Security Assessment Tool. 2.0 was rolled out in 2016. There was a stay put on it for a while they were developing the tool, but then basically the DHS came back and said, okay, we've got an updated tool, let's all start using it. On October 1st, 2016, the new CSAT tool was rolled out, and if people hadn't previously submitted a top screen, there was a requirement to use that. If they had previously submitted a top screen, it was basically at DHS request, or if material modifications were made to the facility requiring you to submit that top screen. The time on that was 60 days. We'll talk more about material modifications and the portions of this program that should be considered evergreen. Okay, we tried to summarize some of the changes for the CSAT 2.0 tool in terms of SVA, new site security plan options, etc. That's for your reference. And let's talk about what you should be doing. So in terms of summary of current requirements, if you're a facility of interest, basically a facility that might have a chemical of interest, that's that Appendix A in the CFATS requirements, if you've made a lot of changes, you may have to resubmit the top screen within 60 days of modification, if you've already submitted one. If you've already submitted one and the DHS wants you to update it, they would have informed you, and based on being required to do it, you would have updated your top screen. So again, your trigger points are if you're already in the program, or if you've already submitted a top screen and you make material modifications or you change your facility. We'll talk more about what those are in a few minutes. Then you need to make sure that you update your top screen. Or if the DHS requests it, then you'll update your top screen. And of course, irrespective of the top screen, if you're one of the tiered facilities and as part of their compliance inspections or other requirements, the DHS may also be asking you to update your SVA and SSP. So let's talk about facilities that have chemicals of interest over the screening threshold quantity that haven't submitted a CSAT top screen. There was a deadline for that. If you haven't done this and if you're on that list, and by the way, links to that list are provided in our reference section in a couple of pages, and you've got that electronically, feel free to look at that. And also, for all these things, don't hesitate to give us a call. This is something we're actively involved in. If you have questions on the program or questions about your facility and whether you need to do a top screen, please give us a call. But for those of you who may not have done that, please be informed that you should have, and that's of course if you're on the COI list above the screening threshold quantity, and you're subject to fines or other potential penalties if you haven't done that. However, pragmatically, if you take a proactive approach to this and get your top screen done, if you haven't done that already, you're probably not going to get fined associated with that. Obviously, that's not under my control, but our experience is that if you take a proactive approach to this, the DHS has bigger fish to fry than jumping on you for just being late on your top screen. Okay, so what's your best course of action? If your CSAT top screen has been previously submitted, make sure that you update it if you make material modifications. Now, I've used that term a couple times, and I just want to make sure I read from a list here because this is important. If you're part of the program and you've got a chemical of interest above the screening threshold quantity, if you have a significant change in the quantity of material, that affects the consequences that can potentially occur if an adversary threat follows through and causes that consequence. That could change the risk associated with your facility, so you may need to do a top screen. If you change your process such that it's potentially riskier or maybe less riskier, you should probably update your top screen. If the threat environment changes, if other operations changes or there's a transfer of ownership, those may be material modifications that can affect the risk at your facility that requires an update of your top screen. Obviously, if the DHS requests a top screen update or an SVA or a site security plan, you've got to follow through with that. And our recommendation is, even if the DHS has not requested an SVA or a site security plan, these exercises, and they can be done simply if you're not specifically requested or required to do it, are very useful for controlling security at your facility. It doesn't have to be complicated. And you can apply the things that make sense to your facility. Those risk-based performance standards have a lot of good tips, and also there's a lot more background information associated with the RBPS that can apply to your facility and also help protect your assets and your personnel. So even if it's not specifically required, understanding these issues and applying things that make sense are quite a good idea. Okay, so provided some additional information. This page has a lot of easy links associated with the program, a lot of background material and guidelines. It's pretty straightforward. It's sometimes interesting reading. It depends on your threshold for your interest threshold, but sometimes it can be interesting reading, and these things are readily available to you. And as I mentioned before, if you do have any questions, give us a call. I provided a bunch of references associated with the CFATS program and chemical facility security in general. And let me talk about webinars, and I'm going to give you a couple minutes here to think about questions that you might have associated with the CFATS program or the presentation that I just did. Happy to answer any questions, and if I can't answer them, I'm happy to get back to you. So let's talk about what we're doing here. As I mentioned before, the webinars that we do are part of our outreach program. We're Risk Management Professionals is a firm that does a lot of SVAs, RMP, PSM activities, and supporting clients' efforts in that respect. What we do is we try to share these best practices with folks. If we use that as an internal training tool, and also why not just turn on the camera and provide some insights to other folks in the industry who may have to deal with this. A lot of people who get saddled with CFATS, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some people who are doing their PSM RMP programs also are getting involved in CFATS. A lot of times it's the security directors at plant sites, or it's a shared effort. So there's a lot of different people that have to do these. Again, if there's any questions, you can call us. As part of our webinar series, we have a couple coming up and invite you to join us on March 1st for MOC and PSSR deficiencies presentation. Common deficiencies, this will tell you a lot of things that people get in trouble for so you can stay out of trouble. On March 13th, an inherently safer design presentation by Jasmine and Sarah in our shop. And on March 27th, an SPA presentation for the new CalARP Program 4 requirements. For those of you who aren't in California, CalARP is California Accidental Release Prevention Program. It's basically a rollout of the EPA's RMP program, but for California facilities. And as you might expect, the threshold quantities of concern are lower for most of the chemicals in California, and there's more stringent requirements associated with those as part of the general CalARP program. And for those of you who are familiar with the RMP and the fact that federally you have program 1, 2, and 3 levels, in California there's a program 4 level, specifically for petroleum refineries with a lot more stringent requirements. SPA is one of those requirements, and we'll be talking about that on March 27th. So I gave you enough time to think about any questions. Let's go ahead and let me just open it up if I can flick the page here. I think you may have taken control, DJ.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the questions.
Can you go into the next slide? Okay, good. So we're going to open it up for questions, and happy to entertain anything that you might want to throw at me.
All right. So the first question that came in is, if I have a co-tenant facility, do both companies have to submit a top screen if the facilities are physically connected?
Okay, the question was if you have a co-tenant facility, do both facilities have to submit a top screen?
If the facilities are physically connected.
If the facilities are physically connected. That's a good question. I will have to get back to you on that. At this point, I would say that if you've got a co-tenant situation where one owner owns one part of the facility and another owner owns another part of the facility, I would expect each of them, as the owner operator, to have to submit a top screen because you may have different site security plans, different management organization, and you may be handling things differently. So especially if you are handling things differently, that may be something where you need to do separate top screens. And we can verify that and get back to you. Please provide an email address to our producer, DJ, and we'll go ahead and verify that.
All right. The second question was, it doesn't seem that difficult. How much effort is required to do a top screen?
All right, that's a good question. Top screens aren't meant to be complicated. Most of these, I was talking to some of the crew this morning in terms of general security issues. When you leave for the day to go to work and you lock your house, when you leave your car and lock your car, if you've got problems with neighbors or somebody else coming on your property, you put up a fence. If you want to do something more advanced, you put up perimeter detectors on your house, video monitoring, etc. These are all basic things we do in our own personal lives. And although we might not write down our site security plan for our house, those kind of concepts still apply very well to industrial facilities. So the whole concept of the top screen as a screening mechanism, as the security vulnerability assessment, and also site security plan, those are things that we're all generally familiar with, conceptually at least. So the program isn't designed to be complicated. The guidelines are good. The computer tool is relatively easy to do. We usually do top screens for clients for about $1,000 just to make sure that the information is submitted properly, that it correlates with your risk management program, and that basically is putting things in the proper perspective for the DHS. So it is fairly straightforward. When we do them for our clients, it's pretty inexpensive and easy to do.
Okay. Another question that came in was, you indicated that top screens should be updated if there have been material modifications. What is a material modification?
Okay, some of the general items that could be material modifications are changes in your quantity of chemical of interest. Obviously, if you have 10,000 pounds of ammonia and you add an extra pound, that's probably not going to significantly alter the consequences associated with your facility. But if you add a lot more, it may change the amount of material that could be released in the event of an adversary threat that passes through a vulnerability and results in a consequence. So if a significant increase or even decrease in your chemical of interest would be a good reason to redo your top screen. A decrease could result in going to a different tier, and the DHS's compliance inspections may be less intense. You may be able to lighten up on your site security plan, or maybe even take you out of the tiers. So whether you go significantly up or significantly down, that would be a material modification. If you change your process, or if you change the type of material that you might use, for example, selective catalytic reaction on facilities that are trying to control NOx emissions from a power plant, those sort of SCR processes could use anhydrous ammonia or aqueous ammonia. So if you change the nature of the material that you're using, that would also be a significant material modification. Changing ownership is a material modification. You might be owned by a facility that's really not very attractive to an adversary, but then you might be bought up by an owner that is on somebody's radar screen. They may have an interest in doing something malicious to that new owner. So that could be a material modification. Personnel changes, significant personnel changes, significant changes in your environment, in the adversarial threat that may exist outside your facility. All those may be material modifications that could trigger a need to update your top screen.
Okay, one more came in. Where can I get access to the COI and TQ list for DHS?
Okay, it should be on the page under references. Let me just verify that real quick. Why don't you go ahead and back up about 4 slides. Okay, so if you look on the summary page, on the fourth bullet on this page, on the summary page, if you go to that summary page, it'll have a direct link to Appendix A. I think towards the top, either that or just go to one of the topics and you can go right to Appendix A. And if you don't see your chemical, or you're concerned that if it's maybe going by another trade name, and should it be on are you really on the COI list even though you call it something differently, just give us a call. We can interpret that very easily.
Okay. There's another question that came in. If there is a multi-tenant scenario at a facility, is it best for the owner to maintain control of the CFATS program instead of transferring it over to the tenants?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm going to ask my audience here for some help. I think this is phone a friend, something like that. So some of you guys have risk management programs where you've got a tenant that's got the equipment, and then the owner basically owns the building where the equipment is. When you're in that situation, who's actually ends up submitting the RMP? So it's usually the building owner then? Okay, so they're collecting the information from the tenant about the equipment, and then it's submitted.
Yes, sometimes the tenant can be involved.
All right, so since everybody's not on mic, let me go ahead and reiterate that. First of all, there's no one answer. In terms of general responsibility, the regulator is typically going to go more after the building owner because they're the continuity for the tenant coming in and out. Now, the building owner and their agreement with the tenant, depending on their contract, may force the tenant to actually do the work and prepare the submittal that then the owner sends over to the regulator. So this would be the more common type situation. However, in all cases, what you want to do is, whether you're the tenant or the owner, you want to protect your liabilities. You want to make sure the submittal gets done and then it's accurate, and regardless of who picks up the bill, and obviously this can be an issue, but regardless of who picks up the bill, the job needs to get done right, and the tenant and the owner need to work, the tenant and the owner need to work together on that and resolve those differences, because if something does happen, the regulator in all cases really doesn't care who's the owner and who's the tenant. It's equipment. They need to protect the public. That's their job.
Okay, I believe that was the last question, so I think that's it.
Okay, very good questions, and I will get back to the person who asked about the joint tenancy for the systems that are interconnected. And anyhow, great questions, good audience. Thank you very much for attending. And if you do have any questions, feel free to give us a call. Thank you.